Hello, everyone, and welcome to our third webinar in our records management series, Tips for Simple and Effective Records Management. This is Anita, and I'm a pre-sales engineer at Laserfiche, so we're going to go ahead and get started. But before we do, I do want to mention that our webinar is going to be an hour long, but we're reserving time for Q&A. So if you have any questions that pop up while we go through our demonstration, feel free to send them through the Q&A feature in WebEx, and we'll be compiling those to answer at the end of our time together. All right, so with that, let's go ahead and get started. So, my name is Anita Chang. I'm a pre-sales engineer at Laserfiche. If you've been to Empower in the past, you may have met me there. Alongside me, I do have Danielle Gilstrap, and she's a content curator at Laserfiche.
Hi everyone, returning here. If you've been to the last few webinars in the series, you'll probably recognize me. So looking forward to another one.
Yes, and so we're both very excited to be here today to talk to you about tools for records management, specifically in Laserfiche. So just to give you an idea of what that's going to encompass today, we're going to start off by defining our records management terms in Laserfiche. Previous webinars have talked about records management in a larger scope, but today we do want to bring it all the way back to our Laserfiche software to identify where those key pieces are within Laserfiche. To do that, we're also going to go over some repository tools that enable our records managers to interact with their records, as well as the administrative interface that allows you to configure your records management properties to whatever it needs to be. Finally, as I mentioned earlier, we'll be doing a Q&A at the end, so any questions, go ahead and send them through Q&A, and we'll address them at the end. All right, so as I mentioned, we're going to start off by just highlighting a few records management concepts in Laserfiche terminology. Since many of you are probably very familiar with records management as a concept in general, this will probably be a breeze, but I do want to take a second and step back and make sure we're all on the same page, and when I use the terms that I will in our demonstration, they will seem familiar to you in the Laserfiche context. So, to start off with, records management is just the practice of managing records throughout their life cycle. So in Laserfiche, we don't mind if you want to keep them from the time that you create those documents, whether you're capturing them through Laserfiche or creating them electronically, and then all the way through its life cycle, we will help you manage it. So for our purposes today, a record is any document whose lifespan is dictated by specific rules. And in Laserfiche, we'll discuss how these can be folders as well. And for our life cycle, we'll be talking about any events that have to happen to this record from the time it's created and active all the way through the end of retention. So those are just some blanket terms for what we're looking at today. And for our records managers on the line, that probably seems very familiar. The next thing we're going to do is step very quickly through the record's life cycle in Laserfiche and how we define certain points in the life cycle of any given record. So here on the left side of our timeline, we do have the active phase. So in Laserfiche, we consider that any length of time that you need to keep working with this document. And that means making annotations or making updates to your file or maybe adding more documentation to a specific record folder. And then to move to our retention time period, we do have a cutoff point. So this is where Laserfiche will say, this is when the document is no longer active and it's ready to move to retention. So with cutoff in Laserfiche, we do have different ways of defining how that point is determined, whether it's at a certain time period, after a certain length of time, or even upon a certain event. So for example, if you have HR records that are going to be inactive after the employee leaves, then we can set that as a cutoff instruction, and at that point we'll move into retention. So retention, that's pretty standard. It's just the length of time a record must be kept. And in Laserfiche, we can help you define how long you want to keep the record for, whether you need to move it to different places during that retention period. And then finally, once we hit the end of that time, we'll go into disposition. So Laserfiche enables you to destroy that electronic record or even accession it to an archive. So those are all options that can cap off the end of your retention schedule, and it really depends on what your organization has as a policy. So if you have permanent records and they don't go through this kind of destruction or accession, that's also something that we can handle in Laserfiche. But in general, our trajectory for our records is going to follow this general life cycle. All right, so that's our very brief overview and definition of records management in Laserfiche. So at this point, we're going to switch over to the software to demonstrate how those tools come into play and how our records managers are going to be able to interact with records in Laserfiche. So I'm going to go ahead and hop over to my web browser here. So what I have open is the Laserfiche web client. And for those of you who are perhaps unfamiliar with Laserfiche or even with this version of the web client, it is accessible through all major internet browsers, and we also have a desktop client. So everything going to show you today, with one exception, is going to be available through both clients, but since this is a new interface, for those of you who are perhaps looking to upgrade as well in your version for Laserfiche, this will be a good preview for what's to come. So I have a repository in Laserfiche that's already set up with some of our records information, and I'm just going to log in as our admin user for today to keep things simple. So of course you can log in with your credentials. If your organization uses Active Directory or LDAP, you can use those here, but I'm going to sign in, and for today we're going to take a look at some documents and folders that we have stored already. So again, just to give a quick introduction to what this looks like, we'll go ahead and take a look at the interface of the web client very quickly. And so let me just zoom in a little bit to make this easier to see. On the left side, we have our folder structure, and that's going to let us navigate through our different contents within the repository. And again, the repository is just where any of our documents are stored. So what you'll immediately see right here, if you haven't worked with Laserfiche Records Management Edition in the past, is that we have a few different kinds of icons that you're seeing. So the folder structure is on the left side, but you can see the contents through the middle as well. So since it's a little larger here, we'll focus on that. At the top, you can see that the series of folders at the top here is in something that resembles banker boxes. So banker's boxes in Laserfiche are going to denote that these have special records properties attached to them. So you can compare that to our quote-unquote regular user folders at the bottom. So those are the manila folders that you're seeing. So these folders are not necessarily going to have records properties attached to them, so that's how you can visually differentiate between the two. So with our bankers boxes, those are actually something that we call record series. So our record series are where we can apply properties to determine our cutoff instructions and retention schedules at the very basic level. So that is one way that we simplify identification of these records. And for records managers out there, you probably aren't going to work with those user folders without records properties. So at the end, we'll discuss ways and best practices for you to organize your repository. So with that in mind, one thing I do want to say is that in Laserfiche, records management is tied to the folder structure. So the way that we apply these properties is really through the placement of your files in these record series, or if we go down one level, our records folders. So with all of these different properties, we allow you to have your documents inherit that information instead of setting it one by one on every folder that you need. So with this kind of inheritance, that means that you can use automated methods of capturing your documents, put them into the right place, and as soon as they're placed in the correct place in the folder structure, they'll inherit all the cutoff instructions and retention schedules that are necessary. So folder structure is very key to our Laserfiche records management system, and as you'll see, this kind of makes it simpler for you to administer everything since it's not on a document-per-document basis. All right, so just to point out what we're looking at here, we do have these special record folders. So in Laserfiche, our best practice is to take care of records at the folder level. So instead of doing it one by one on a document, what we'll do is compile this record folder, and you can cut them off and dispose of them at the same time as one unit. So that's really our best practice here, and again, that plays into our ability to have records management information be inherited at the folder level. All right, so with this folder selected, I do want to draw your attention to some of the information that's on the screen. In the web client, we do have something called the details pane that sits over here on the right side, and this is where you can have at-a-glance information about your documents, whether it's your templates or your fields. But today, since we're focusing on records management, that's the thing we're seeing right here. So we have this records pane that allows you to see any particular information about that record in the right side without opening it up. So there's no mystery as to what kind of properties this record series has. So at a general level, for our recreation registrations in our Park and Recreation department, we keep these for a full year before we decide they're not active anymore, and then after that, we'll put them in retention for 3 years and then destroy them. So Laserfiche will display a lot of these properties for you from the very beginning. And for our individual files, based off of when we filed them in Laserfiche, we also get a life cycle that goes alongside with it. So you can see here that this particular record was filed in 2012, and based off of that information and the cutoff and retention instructions that Laserfiche has determined for it, we've given you a life cycle that you can follow to automatically know at which point further actions are necessary. So the entire design premise of this interface is to make it so that all of this information is accessible from one place, and it makes it easier for your records manager to come in and know immediately what's awaiting their attention. So for example, on the right side, you can see that there is a green button that says destroy, and we'll return to this, but we'll first talk about how you can use cutoff for your specific documents. So if we go to a different view of a document, we'll see that this document is not yet eligible for cutoff. So there is no green button, which means that Laserfiche doesn't have a particular action that it believes is ready for you to take. So anything that's most likely to happen in that life cycle will be displayed as an action. So we'll return to our initial folder to take it. And in our case, you can see that we've already cut off this particular record folder, and now we can simply destroy it by clicking the button. So anytime we destroy items in Laserfiche, we do present you with the option to retain metadata. So for those of you who are unfamiliar with Laserfiche metadata, it's just a way of keeping indexing information about your document alongside your file, and you can keep it even if the actual record is destroyed. So that gives you the ability to report on the information even when you have complied with your records management policy and destroyed those records. So you can see here that it says metadata will be retained. So these are just small things that add up to a much easier experience for our records managers. Since we've specified that the metadata will be retained, you can see now that our records folder now has a little X through it. So that lets you know that the actual file is no longer stored in Laserfiche, but we've kept the metadata, so this is something we can always return to and refer to as well. One thing worth noting is that in addition to records management in Laserfiche, we also have something called Audit Trail. So that allows you to track any of the actions that are being taken in your repository, which includes records management actions. So for those of you who use the repository and are already familiar with that general functionality in Audit Trail, it's worth noting that you can prove your compliance through Audit Trail by logging those specific cutoff or accessioning or destruction action. You don't need to keep the metadata if it's not something that's helpful to you. So all in all of these options exist so that you can tailor them to your specific policy and make sure that you're complying with whatever retention schedules or cutoff instructions are necessary for you here. So that was one example of how we can act on a specific records folder to destroy something. But one thing I do want to make sure we highlight in this webinar is the Records Management Quick Access menu. So this is one thing that does exist within the web client that is not in the Windows client. And one thing we'll see is that it does simplify the process of finding the records that we need to act on quite a bit. So our Records Management Quick Access menu will be accessible to anybody who has the specific security access to act on our records here. So at the top, we can go ahead and run quick predefined searches that lets you see everything that's at a certain status. So here, anything that's eligible for cutoff, we'll go ahead and run our search, and it will pull up a list of anything that's ready for us to cut off in our repository. So instead of going through our folders one by one, what we can do as the records manager is come here on a predefined basis, maybe once a week or even every day. And once we've gone through these different files and ensured that they are in fact ready to be cut off, we can select all of them and we can cut them off all at the same time. So this simplifies things a bit. Even though it's very simple to cut off a record folder individually, it's even simpler to find them as a bulk action. So this allows us to cut off our records, and as soon as I hit OK, those record actions have been performed, and if we now refresh, everything has been cleared out. So we've taken care of anything that was waiting for us as the records manager to cut off. One thing you might be wondering is whether we can automate some of this cutoff or destruction, and Laserfiche on purpose makes these manual actions that the records manager has to take. And that's because Laserfiche Records Management is DoD 5015.2 certified, so there are certain items that we are making sure to comply with that policy, and that is one of the highest levels of certification that records management can receive. So these items are going to be completed by a records manager so that we can make sure someone has taken a look at them. And the other reason is because if we accidentally set our properties incorrectly, we don't want the system to automatically get rid of things for you. So there's still a large role for a records manager to play in terms of going through these items, making sure that they're ready for whatever action you need to take, and we're just simplifying the ability to find these items for your actions. So with our cutoff folders, we've gone ahead and cut off everything in our repository that is eligible. We can also find things that are eligible for disposition. So one thing I will point out is that even though you can perform bulk actions through this menu, it won't allow you to take actions that are different all at the same time. So that's kind of like a safeguard to make sure you are paying attention to those different disposition actions. So here in our column views, which I've customized to display records management information, you can see that some of these are going to be destroyed and one of them is going to be accessioned. And because we have that different action here, we can't take them all at the same time. So if everything's going to go through the same process, then sure, we can go ahead and destroy them. And you'll see that same confirmation message that we went through earlier. And once we've destroyed them, we can still streamline this a bit. So we've taken care of a few folders at once. But for our item that is going to be eligible for accession, you can see it has a slightly different view. And this particular employee file is for someone who has retired, so we're going to accession it. And this will allow us to download a Laserfiche briefcase of any eligible entries that are part of this. So a Laserfiche briefcase is just a form of packaging those documents in Laserfiche with their metadata and their file structure intact So you can use that briefcase to go ahead and put that information elsewhere. So that's what that download button is in the left side. And with that briefcase, you can keep any of the metadata information if that is an option you've selected and move it to the location that we specified in the policy. So we'll take a look at how those policies are configured, but we do have the ability in Laserfiche to also specify other locations you're using for storage of your records, for instance. So that can provide you with a reminder to move them to the right place after it's done with its retention schedule in Laserfiche. So let's go ahead and confirm this accession. And since it is no longer eligible for disposition, it will now disappear once we've refreshed our page. One other item that we can build into any records management system in Laserfiche is something called vital records, which is just referring to items that need to be reviewed on a certain interval. So here we have a master plan for one of our departments that is reviewed on a calendar yearly cycle. So in records management, while we have a separate policy for this particular document, we can specify review dates that this record should go through, even if it's not ready to be cut off or dispositioned. So with that review, we can go ahead and specify that we are a little bit late. We should have reviewed this at the beginning of the year. But with that date, it will calculate when the next time we'll need to take a look at this document is, and we'll mark it as reviewed. And Laserfiche will keep that information as well. So those are some of our more basic actions that will be in your day-to-day of Laserfiche records management. We also build in the tools that allow you to handle those off situations. So for example, if you need to backfile something, you can change the filing date. If you need to freeze something in Laserfiche, that's something you can do as well. So let's take a look at that. So in our Parks and Recreation Department, if we have a grant that needs to go through a financial audit that will require us to take a little bit more time and not have it progress down its retention schedule, what we can do instead of taking it out of records management is simply enable a records freeze. So if I select the file that I need to freeze, we'll go ahead and use our record actions to go ahead and freeze this item, and it will even prompt us for a freeze reason. So one thing to take note of is that in Laserfiche records management, this is something that you can delegate to other users as well. So if you're a records manager, you constantly have different people coming to you asking you to freeze this or that, that's something that we can actually deploy as part of our access rights in the repository. So you can give specific individuals the ability to freeze content, and that will prevent it from moving down its path. So essentially, that will hold it in place in its life cycle, and that will enable you to comply with any legal holds that you need to place. So with this freeze reason, we'll go ahead and say that we have a financial audit taking place. And that places a freeze as well as a little visual icon for you to know that this entry is currently under a freeze. You can also see that information updated here, and this prevents us from setting event dates as well. Since it is in that legal freeze, we will not progress down our records management path until the freeze is lifted. So there are a couple items like this within records management that allow you to handle any of those other use cases that extend beyond just cutting off documents or dispositioning them. You can also uncut off items if you need to make changes to them later. So we have some flexibility in how you can work with your entries even while they're within records management. One thing I do want to note, however, is that all of this records management information is searchable. So if you're used to using Laserfiche, you're probably familiar with our quick search that allows you just to quickly survey everything within your repository, but all of your records management properties are also available through the advanced search. So we'll let that pop up. The advanced search allows us to configure a more specific search. So that's going to let us pair template searches, for instance, or folder search with records management properties. So to configure a search, all I would have to do is go to our records management properties at the very bottom. And you can see here that even though we have that quick access menu on the left side that we were working with earlier, we can still use those same properties to do a more specific search and look for things by their status. So if I wanted to find my entry that was frozen, and if we had more frozen records than the one that I just froze, we could go and put this frozen records search into our advanced search, use any other properties that we would like in conjunction, and then we can find frozen records as well as search in your freeze reasons. So all of the information that you are adding on to this entry in terms of records management is searchable, and it is information that Laserfiche will keep for you in order to expedite the searching that you're going to do. As with any advanced search, you can save all of these properties. So if you're constantly looking for frozen records or you want to make a report out of it, that's absolutely something you can do by saving that record search as one of your custom advanced searches. So we'll go ahead and just run a quick search here. And you can see that there are a few things that are frozen, so that will pull up our frozen records, and since that's the only configuration that we've put in our search, it's pretty limited to anything that we've just frozen in our repository, so it's found it for us here. And again, you can deselect your item and click Generate Report to go ahead and have a listing of anything that is returned from the results, just like in your normal advanced search. All right, so to recap what we've done so far, we've been working through the repository with those specific records management tools that allow our records managers to see the properties they need on the entries within the particular folder view or the quick access menu. The next piece of the software that we are going to take you through briefly is the admin interface. So here in Laserfiche Web Client, in our latest version, 10.2, we have added a management page into the web client itself. So that allows our power users, or perhaps records managers, who want to configure those record properties to go ahead and access it from within the web client instead of having to gain access to another administration console. So under management, we'll be able to define those records management terms as well as any other items you have access to. So since records management is such a core component of the repository, it's not separated out from all the other functionality. It is just existing alongside it, so any of those other properties that we can manage appear in this page as well, but what we're interested in today, in particular, is our records section. So everything that we've been working with so far has had properties applied to it. And so the way that you define these in Laserfiche is through this menu. We do start you off with a few review cycles that are standard so that you don't have to start from scratch, but you do have the ability to configure any of these to your specific needs. So in our case, review cycles might be used for anything from that vital records review to our cutoff instructions, so you can define those intervals that you want to use in order to use them within those other rules. So there are all these different building blocks within records management that you have the ability to change. For example, events refers to any events that might begin a retention schedule, and you can use those over and over so you're not creating individual properties for every single kind of record that you have. Anything that you place here within our management page does allow you to reuse them within other properties so that you can make sure you're streamlining creation, and if you already have an event or location that fits the bill, you can reuse it in those cutoff instructions. So to harken back to the beginning of our webinar, we did talk about some of those different points within a record's life cycle that are important for Laserfiche to know. And those, again, are those cutoff instructions where that record goes from active to retention. And you can see here that we have the ability to define those cutoff instructions as needed with different types as well. So you can define those however you want, and then you'll select those when you create a record series in Laserfiche, and we pair those cutoff instructions with the retention schedule. So after we've signified that our document is no longer active, we'll have it go through a cutoff instruction and then into our retention schedule. So this is where you can tell Laserfiche how long to hold on to something for and whether you need to transfer them between locations. So you can see here that you can name these whatever you want. If there are very specific rules for a particular record type, you can create a custom retention schedule for it, or you can even create schedules such as retain 4 years, then destroy, and that can be applied to as many different record series as you like. So that's our administrative interface that allows you to go ahead and specify the different tools that you want to use. And with that in mind, we're just going to quickly go back to our repository view to see where they are applied. So here you can see that for our grants records, we do apply a specific cutoff instruction and retention schedule. And for users with clearance, they are able to come here and edit the properties and choose from any cutoff instructions that have been defined already. Same thing for the retention schedule. You'll see that if I choose a different item, it does change the description here, so that's an easy way for you to keep track of what's actually happening within that cutoff instruction. So this also means that if there is a change in policy and you do need to change the amount of time that you're holding those particular grant files in this case, you can switch the records management information to comply with whatever new policy you are following. And so Laserfiche does enable you to apply those properties to everything within a specific record series, or you can just choose to go day forward. So, for example, if the length of time shortens, you can have the retention schedule still be the same for any folders that have been created previously, and then just put the records properties on there later. All right, so at this point, we've covered what properties we can change for records management within the aptly named management page, and those are all properties that you can access from the repository to make it easy to work with your records. The final item that we're going to address today is how you can make this repository setup work for both records managers and your business users who are probably used to seeing their files in a specific folder format. So, as I pointed out in the very beginning, we do have different types of files here at our repository. So this allows us to hold everything in the same place, and we'll use security in Laserfiche to control what people have access to. But in our case, the questions we're aiming to address are on my slide over here. So something that we like to call transparent records management helps us with our specific use cases. So since our departments, rather than our specific records managers, usually want to see their documents in a specific folder structure, we want our files to be kept in those record series so that they inherit those retention schedules, but we want to put those files into a view that gives business users what they're looking for. So we use something called transparent records management. So on the left side is something that our records manager might see, and it's organized by policy and those different retention schedules and properties that they organize things with. Whereas on the right side, for our end users, what we'll do is go ahead and set up that folder structure they're used to, and then use Laserfiche to create shortcuts of the original copy to those end user files. So the key to this is that we are not going to duplicate those records, since as records managers know, duplication is devil. So with our specific records items in our records series, we're going to keep those original copies there. We're not going to make other copies. We're going to link our users to those specific files from within the folder format that they're used to. So again, at Laserfiche, we call this transparent records management because it gives our users a clear view into those original files. We don't have people making copies that are hard to track down and place through our retention schedules. We'll have them all refer to the same items, but give them a view that makes sense to them. All right, and so today we've covered a lot of different topics, from using records management within the Laserfiche repository to setting up your records management properties, and even some considerations that you might have when you go about designing your records management system in your repository. On one final note, I'm going to let Danielle talk about our next installment.
Thank you. So we have another records management focused webinar coming up in September. It's going to be the 4th one in our series, and this one's going to be particularly helpful for anyone out there who's involved in state or local government, because it's going to be focusing on enabling better public service through public information technology, particularly strengthening the ties between those who are responsible for crucial records and processes. It's going to be given by 2 presenters, one with an IT background and one with a records management background. So they're both going to be giving their perspectives and their advice for how they manage to really revolutionize their public service. So be sure to join us. It's going to be on September 6th at the same time, 11 a.m. Pacific Standard Time. That's 2 p.m. on the East Coast. This promises to be a really engaging presentation, so I hope to see you all there.
All right, thanks, Danielle. So at this point, we do want to make sure we spend some time going over any questions that you might have, and we know we've already gotten a few from our Q&A section in WebEx. So just to remind you to go ahead and submit those questions. You'll go to your WebEx screen, and we'll go ahead and start answering a few of them. All right, so our first question is from Robin, and the question is, what if we have a cutoff of 1 year and a retention of 3 years? Why not just a retention of 4 years? So the subtlety to this is that before a record is cut off, everything in that record folder is going to be still accessible, and you can work with it the same way. Once we have the records folder move into retention, that's when we signify that it's inactive. So if you want to make changes to your document, it will have to be in the active phase of its life cycle. So generally, that cutoff will want to be defined at a point where you no longer need to make changes to the entry. So with that cutoff of 1 year, what we're really saying is, okay, so we've created this entry and we've had it for a year now. At this point, it's unlikely that anyone's going to make changes to the metadata or annotate it or use it on a daily basis. So then we can put it into its retention schedule. So you're right in that 1 year cutoff and 3 year retention does end up with a total records life cycle of 4 years, but there's just some intricacy in terms of whether you want it to be active or not in that time span. All right, so that kind of ties into the next question, which is, when cutoff has occurred and retention is applied, what changes in the document? For instance, is it read-only now? And that's absolutely the case. So you've got it. When you cut off an entry in Laserfiche, it becomes read-only. You also can't move it around, so it's a little bit more stringent than just marking something as read-only for read-only user, for instance. So when you cut it off, you can no longer make changes to annotation. You cannot change the text. You can't change anything about that record because as it's sitting in retention, it is not meant to be worked with. All right. So our next question from Helen is, if a record is eligible for disposition, does it just show folders with everything attached within the folder, or can we see both folders and individual documents that need to be destroyed as well? And that's an excellent question. So as you've mentioned, the case is that within the quick access menu, searching for things that are eligible for disposition, you can go ahead and also choose to show the documents as well. Since our best practice is to work with everything at the folder level, we were showing the view that only shows the folders, but you can choose to have documents show up alongside the folders that are eligible for disposition. All right. And the next question is, how do we know we have the records management program? And so that's a great question. So since the records management functionality is built into the repository, this is something that you might want to check with your system administrator for. You can see that property alongside the server information for your Laserfiche server within the admin console. The reason why I'm taking that approach is that you may have records management and you might not have access to it because of security settings. So to be sure, I would double check with whoever administers your Laserfiche system since it is something that is tied to your license. All right. And so the last question that we've received so far is, what version of Laserfiche are you using? And so the one I'm using today is Laserfiche 10.2. And more specifically 10.2.1. But everything that I've shown today is available starting from Laserfiche version 10.2. The management page is the new piece in 10.2, but all the records management information otherwise has been updated to look like that interface since the beginning of version 10, which was released in late 2015. All right. So those are all the questions that we have so far. We'll go ahead and stay on the line to see if you have any additional questions that you'd like us to answer. And so if you do, feel free to send them through the Q&A, and we'll go from there. All right, so we've just received another question from Tammy. What is accession? And so accession is a form of disposition. So disposition is the last part of our records life cycle. So at the very end of the retention time period, you get to choose whether you're going to get rid of that document entirely or if you're going to move it somewhere else. So a normal example of this would be if you need to move that record to offsite storage, since it's not important for you to have easy access to it once it's done with the retention schedule, but you do want to make sure you hold on to it. So accession is that specific form of final disposition of moving it elsewhere, essentially. So in Laserfiche, what we do to simplify that is allow you to download those files as a Laserfiche briefcase and also take note of where it's going. So the reason why you might do this is because, especially with your Laserfiche server, keeping all that information ready at your fingertips might mean that you're putting it on the fastest retrieval media that you can get. If you're saving an electronic record for archival, essentially, you might choose to put it on a different media type and also store it somewhere far away. So that's an option if you are accessioning. All right. Our next question is, does having different metadata on folders and individual documents not matter because everything will show up when it needs to be destroyed? And that is correct. So records management adds in another layer, and you can think of it kind of like metadata. It's information about your folder that gives you more notifications, essentially, when you need to take action on it. So even if you have different templates, Records Management Edition information in Laserfiche exists on a different level, so whatever is ready for disposition or cutoff will show up regardless of its file type or location in the folder structure. So that will just comply with whatever record properties it has. It's not going to be determined by template type. All right, and another question we do have is it normal practice to keep the metadata after you destroy the record? And that's a really good question. So there's no specific best practice from us as Laserfiche regarding this. Some people do choose to keep the metadata. One thing to note is that if you keep the metadata, as we saw, the entry is going to be marked with that sign on the records folder, but it's going to stay in that folder perpetually. So if you are constantly cutting off those records, you may want to take a look at whether you want to keep that information there, since it could become a pretty large log of items that you have cut off. It's worth mentioning that for every retention schedule that you configure, you can specify whether you want metadata or not. So it doesn't have to be all or nothing. There could be specific file types that it's very important that you keep the metadata, and you can go ahead and choose it for those only. And our next question is, does this system only contain metadata for records, or can it contain the actual scan files and records too? And yes, so Erin, that's a great question. What we showed today was really a quick highlight on records management, but the key thing to remember is that records management as a component is meant to be a part of your repository. So you would absolutely store those actual files in there. So with the folder structure that we were showing, the ones we were working with were more sample data, but you could keep actual documents in there with their metadata set up in Laserfiche. And in fact, let's hop over to the repository to just take a quick look. So I don't want to confuse anyone in that showing all of this is just by folders, but with our folders, what we would do is organize those particular files. So for example, if we have employee files that we wanted to save here, we would have the actual contents within the repository as well. So that's a great clarification. Other items, so can we track records requests as well? And so yes, that's probably something that we would use one of our automation pieces for in Laserfiche, whether it be a form or workflow. So you could have people request through a Laserfiche form, and what we've done in the past is use workflow to go ahead and send out that record to them through a public portal. So if you have WebLink, that's one way that we could send out those requests. And so with these records, you could automate that, and that's something you can actually find in the business process library. So if you are using Laserfiche forms, I believe version 10 and higher, we do have the business process library that gets you started with a few template processes, and the records request is one of them. And so we have a follow-up question on the records request. Does it or can it automatically send the records the person requests, or is it a manual action? Does it do metrics, and can it show reports? So these are all great questions. This functionality is probably best encompassed through Laserfiche forms, again, with a combination of workflow. And it does depend on how you're going to define this process. So if you want someone to be notified to go into the repository and manually find the records that they're looking for, that's absolutely one way you can build it. If you wanted Laserfiche to automatically send records, then you would have to have a predefined system that would allow people to know which record they're requesting. So that's probably something that would take a little bit more requirements gathering, but the short answer is yes, we could do both those things. Within Laserfiche forms as well, we have out-of-the-box dashboards. So the operational dashboard and performance dashboard let you know who's sitting on tasks within the process, where is something within the process, or how long is it taking on average for us to go ahead and file a complete records request from beginning to end. So those kind of metrics are available. We can show reports with any information that's collected on a form. And again, that is slightly separate than what we're seeing today, but it is a good component to also include. Hello everyone, Anita again here. We do want to thank you so much for all the questions that you've brought to us. It's been really great to go through some of those with you today. And again, as Danielle mentioned, we do have a fourth webinar as part of this series in September, so we highly encourage you to check that out. And it's been our pleasure to host this webinar for you all today. And if you have any further questions, feel free to reach out. And if not, have a great rest of your Wednesday.